Criticism and English Literature, organized by A.C.T. Academy, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, in association with the Constituent College of CVM University, Gujarat. It's a privilege to introduce the resource person of today's session, Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir, Professor and Dean, Center for English Studies, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, Central University of Gujarat, who is going to handle the session on 20th century and modern critical theories. Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir, is a professor at the Center for English Studies at Central University of Gujarat. He serves as a chairperson of the center. His research interests are specifically in the area of science fiction as it developed in Bengal. His recent book on ICT in English language education, Bridging the Teaching Learning Divide in South Asia, has been published in 2022. He is currently working on the book project on science fiction in Bengal with Liverpool University Press. He has been the recipient of honor by Trust Fellowship UK and was awarded the Gaurav Sinha. With this very short note, let's kick out to the session. For that, I would like to welcome Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, sir, to present his session. Welcome, sir. Now the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Nandini, and thank you, A.C.T. Thank you, ILSASS. Thank you, CVM University, for having me over. So what I'm going to do is, well, it's impossible to do literary criticism and theory in 1 hour. So I'm going to ask some pertinent questions, and I would expect, so it's going to be more of a conversation rather than a long lecture. I do have some inputs, but I would like you to participate in whatever I'm saying. And this has been a question that has been there for quite a long time, and people who have come from literature would know that there's distinction between what is called literary criticism. So you might have, for example, separate papers for literary criticism when you are teaching BA courses or MA courses, and separate papers for literary theory. Okay, and this distinction for some time seems to be at times arbitrary and at times questionable, and at times very weird when you look at this distinction. But the distinction kind of remains, and it seems that this literary criticism is something that happened, let's say, right from Plato and Aristotle and Longinus and Horace to about 20th century, when a new school of criticism came into existence, new criticism, etc. And then suddenly in the 1940s and 50s, and it started gaining momentum in the 1960s and 70s, you have something called literary theory. It seems to be very different from what literary criticism was doing. So there seems to be a historical disjunction between what is literary criticism and what is literary theory. So as if literary theory is something that comes into existence with the 60s and the 70s, 1960s and the 70s, while literary criticism has a longer historical trajectory, right from Plato, Aristotle, etc. So when we do our literary criticism, or when we are trained in literary criticism, we tend to begin from the Greeks and the Romans and then move on to English literary criticism. And if you are lucky, we also look at European literary criticism like Hegel and Rousseau and others, etc. But then we kind of come down to the 40s and the 50s. We start with Saussure, and with Saussure structuralism, we then move on to structuralism, post-structuralism, which doesn't seem to be treated as okay, thank you. So, which doesn't seem to be treated as literary criticism anymore, but it's treated as more as literary theory. Okay, and then you have these big books, which includes Terry Egerton's Literary Theory and Introduction, where this distinction is kind of cemented. So you kind of are made to believe that there is something called literary theory, which is very distinct from literary criticism, etc. So one of the questions that I would like to begin this discussion, I would not call it a session, is that what do you think are the differences? I mean, if anyone could put it, so what is the distinction between criticism and theory? How do you make that distinction? If you can have some very quick responses.
Sir, I think that theory is the framework whereas criticism is evaluation.
Okay, all right.
Theory is something which is, I mean, theoretical, and criticism is its practical application. But, sir, as you're talking about the theories in the 60s and 50s and all the theories were not pertaining to literature. In fact, there were theories in different disciplines like psychoanalysis, in language, anthropology, linguistics, and these theories were somehow applied to literature afterwards. I mean, their source is not English literature.
Okay. So one of the questions, I mean, so let me play the devil's advocate and let me put this question across them. Then, for example, when we discuss in literary criticism, people like Plato, Aristotle, or Rousseau, for that matter, or Hegel, for that matter, or from the German Romantics, for example, Schlegel, and you have Schopenhauer, etc. So when we look at these people whom we kind of club together in literary criticism, so if you just take the good old example of Plato, then Plato was definitely not talking about literary pieces, so practical criticism in that sense. So he was not really looking at analyzing texts. He was looking at a larger theoretical model for understanding literature or for understanding arts in general. So one of the concerns that we might have if we take this distinction as something, criticism as something practical, etc., and criticism and theory as something which is not practical, or which is more foundational, more theoretical in that sense, more abstract in that sense, then Plato would definitely fall into the category of literary theory. If we take the distinction of interdisciplinarity, in terms of that theory is extremely interdisciplinary, for example, and you're completely right. I mean, Levi-Strauss, for example, comes from the field of anthropology. Derrida comes from the field of philosophy. Foucault comes from the field of history. Lacan comes from the field of psychoanalysis, etc. So when you look at these so-called theoreticians, of when we study them in literary theory, we say that, okay, they actually were doing psychoanalysis, but we can use that theoretical model to understand literary texts. But if we go back to these people, the so-called literary theorists, then again there is an issue over there, because they also have done literary criticism. So if you remember the famous Lacanian essay on Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter, okay, where he traces the unconscious in the purloined letter. Or if you look at Foucault's understanding of Shakespeare in his Madness and Civilization, or if you look at Derrida's series of literary analysis of different kinds of French authors, if you look at Levi-Strauss's understanding of myths, which can be, broadly speaking, called literature, where he analyzes myths to understand how the structures of myths operate, etc. So they're also doing literary criticism. But interestingly, we kind of overlook that, and we say that, okay, they are kind of interdisciplinary, they belong to a different discipline, and that discipline has an influence on literature as such. The same thing applies to Plato. I mean, Plato was not really interested in literature in that. Of course he was, but he was trying to move towards a larger theoretical model to understand reality, what we in philosophy called epistemology. So he was looking at a theory of knowledge and how is knowledge produced. So that's what his larger foundational aim was. So it gets a bit muddied, actually, when we try to kind of make these distinctions between criticism and theory. Any other comments that you have? Okay, let me get on with this. And of course, please feel free to unmute yourself and raise a hand, and we can have a discussion. Sorry, was Dr. Seema trying to say something? No, okay. So let's look at what do we really mean by this idea of criticism and theory, and what is that transition that we are looking into when we move from criticism to theory, or if we ever actually move from criticism to theory in that sense, or have we moved from theory to criticism, etc. And if you look at the history of criticism, and I'm just going to stick to English literary criticism. I'm not going to get into the French, the German traditions, etc., and the other European traditions and the American tradition. So if you look at the history of criticism in England, in English literary criticism, then what tends to happen is that we tend to begin with because there's a kind of a renewal of the Greek and the Roman ideas during the Renaissance. So you have the coming back of Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, and they become the models for doing English literary criticism. So if you look at the entire tradition of texts, right from Philip Sidney, right through Dryden and Pope and Dr. Johnson and everyone. So if you look, or even before them, Milton, for example, then you see that most of those models that you have in English literary criticism are primarily derived from the Greek and the Roman ones. Okay, so that's the model that has been taken. And then, of course, that model is then employed to understand English literature, English literary products, etc. But of course, and since we belong to the post-colonial age now, and there is a lot of talk about decolonialism, there is also a hidden agenda behind it, because of course there is a huge amount of continental wars happening in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And there is this idea of the nation formation. Okay, so England has to be shown as this great nation with great literature, with great canonical writers, with a huge historical tradition, etc. And so literary criticism does play an important role in producing all this. So you have something called English literature now, and you can trace it back historically, and you can say that, okay, it has a long tradition right from Beowulf in the 5th century AD to modern writers, etc. There's another hidden agenda, of course, that by the 19th century, remember, the British control half of the world, and English starts getting taught in many of these colonies, so India being one of them. And because English has never been taught in England, because remember, English as a literary product was never taken very seriously as an academic subject. So people who would go to the universities like Oxford and Cambridge in England would study Latin and Greek, because they were, and if you remember the early texts like Francis Bacon, any serious text. So Bacon, for example, his serious writing was always in Latin. It was only when he was doing non-serious writing or literary writing, he would use English. So Bacon's essays, which we studied, is written in English, but his other major texts in science and scientific methods is all written in Latin, Novum Organum, for example. And since English was never really taken as an academic discipline in England, what happens is that English becomes a subject in many of the colonies, including in large parts of Africa, large parts of South Asia, and in the frontier provinces like Australia, New Zealand, etc. Now, since you have the study of English literature now as a part of it, you also need criticism. So criticism becomes a discipline that can produce literature in that sense. And you can produce canonical literature that can be studied in classrooms, discussed, debated, your material on that, etc. So criticism also has this darker side in that sense, English criticism. But if we keep this aside, and as I said, and I was trying to say that you have criticism developing largely from the Greek theories, if we may call them theory, though they are included in criticism. But if you take Plato, Aristotle as theorists of knowledge, theorists of literature, then what they're doing is they're taking these models and then you're using it in different ways. Okay, and this goes on till about the 19th century, early 19th century. Or late 18th century, let's call it. Let's say till about the 1760s and 1770s. What happens after that, and I find it very interesting, and I'm sure that you will read scholarship on this, there are lots of scholars have written about this, is what we call the Romantic movement. Okay. And I think that's an interesting intervention in criticism for many reasons, but the prime reason that I find very interesting in the Romantic criticism, and we really can't do English Romantics without thinking about European Romantics and the French Romantics, then what tends to happen, and we might call it the first coming of what we can call modern criticism, which is separate from the Renaissance and Augustine, other forms of criticism. So the coming of modern criticism probably can be traced back to the Romantics. Now, why am I saying this? And of course, we can have a discussion on this. The one thing that you notice in the Romantic critical canon, in the Romantic critical writings, for example, by Wordsworth or Coleridge or Shelley or Keats or Lamb or any others, is that it is almost for the first time that the figure of the individual, the figure of the individual creative becomes central to criticism. Okay. I won't go back to Plato and Aristotle, etc., but even if you go back to Sidney or Dryden, the major critics of the earlier eras. Now, Sidney's concern is not really glorifying the writer. Sidney's concern is glorification of the text. So you have a certain kind of critical practice, and that critical practice needs to be understood in a certain ways. And he uses the Aristotelian Platonic model, that what is known as Neo-Aristotelianism, to understand how literature works. Okay. So there, of course, he mentions the poet. So poet is the maker. He calls it the patis. So he uses the Latin word patis, who makes. Okay. And he leaves it at that. So his concern is not the poet in that sense. If you look at Dryden, for example, in the say of dramatic poesy, in dramatic poesy, Dryden's concern is again not really the individual poet. It is really the conflict, the contradictions between the ancients and the moderns, the French and the English. So if you remember a say of dramatic poesy by Dryden, there are these four interlocutors, four people who are sitting in a barge while England is getting bombed, actually. And they are discussing drama. And their concern is, what is the distinction between ancient drama and modern drama? What is the distinction between the English drama and French drama, etc.? But again, the central concern definitely is not the individual writer, individual poet, though Shakespeare is discussed, Johnson is discussed, etc. With the Romantic poets and the Romantic criticism, what you have for the first time probably, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, is that the central concern of criticism becomes the individual consciousness. Okay. So right from Wordsworth to Coleridge to Keats, so if you look at Wordsworth, for example, Wordsworth's central concern is not simply poetry, but poetry as it is processed through the individual consciousness. Okay. So it is not simply a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but it is also recollections and tranquility, and those recollections happen through an individual consciousness. Similarly, for Coleridge, the distinction between the primary and the secondary imagination is everyone possesses primary imagination, but it's only the individual consciousness of the poet which can transmute it into the secondary imagination. So the poet has a special place in that sense. You look at Shelley, for example, in fact, Shelley's famous definition of the poet was that they are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So they are the ones who will lay down the rules for the world. Or if you look at Keats's idea of negative capability, it's again processed to this idea of the individual consciousness. So individual consciousness becomes an important aspect of criticism. And you have this birth of the individual genius, I would say, with Romantic criticism. And that is where you have the first inkling of what we can call modern criticism. In English literary criticism, of course, it can be extended to French and German as well. Now, if we take a pause over here and we think of criticism, again, I'll stick to only the English literary criticism. So this is one spectrum. So this is one part of the larger spectrum that starts around the 1798, if we take the publication of Little Ballads as that date, as where modern, what I'm calling modern literary criticism begins. Then you have one part of the spectrum which kind of completely validates or exalts the individual consciousness. So the individual consciousness becomes an important part of the creative process. And in order to understand anything that is creative, including poetry or anything, you need to understand the individual consciousness. So you have one one aspect of the spectrum over here. But of course, by the end of the 19th century, so if you come to around 1870s and 1880s, and even in the middle of the 19th century, if you remember the 1850s, you have other voices also. So the voices which would say that the question of art or the question of literature having a purpose doesn't exist anymore. So Aristotle is completely thrown out from the equation. So Aristotle, remember, literature has an effect. So that effect or impact of literature is an important aspect of the entire tradition of literary criticism. But by the 1850s and the 1860s, people have started questioning this, again, because of the idea of the individual consciousness. Now, because literature or any form of an art is processed through the individual consciousness, the ideal goal of that is not really upliftment or instruction or didactic. So the function of art is no more simply giving you models. Okay, so that's not the function of art. And if you look at different kinds of movements like the pre-Raphaelite movement that happened in the 1850s, or the later movements where 1870s and 80s, what the movements like art for art's sake or aestheticism. So if you look at these critical movements, or symbolism for that matter, what you have is a certain moving away from the literary text as something that needs to have an impact, to the idea of the literary text as something that has nothing to do with reality. Okay, so it is art for art's sake, remember. So the final goal of literature or final goal of any form of art is not really, that is not the primary goal. It might have an impact, but that is not the primary goal of creation. And because the individual consciousness does not process reality for creating something else or creating an impact or creating an effect. The individual consciousness produces creativity or produces a creative work or creative art because that's what it does. That's the final goal. There is no end to it. So there is a means, but there is no end. And we end with this kind of a conjuncture at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so we begin in 1798, almost at the beginning of the 19th century, with this idea of the individual consciousness. And by the end of the 19th century, we reach a kind of a place where the individual consciousness does not have a relation with what is happening with the creative work, the effect, the impact, etc., but is done just for its own sake. Okay, so you have this entire spectrum of the 19th century coming into existence. And it is at this point of time that you have a reaction to this. Yeah. So if you remember the early forms of literary criticism that happened during this period, so Coleridge's Kubla Khan, for example, was analyzed by taking into account whatever Coleridge did throughout that period when he was writing Kubla Khan. It came out as a massive, massive book because you had to trace the individual consciousness to create. So the idea is not what the poem is doing, what the impact of the poem is, what the effect of the poem is, but how does the individual consciousness create this great work of art. Now, if we keep this in mind, this very long trajectory, and I'm trying to cover this entire trajectory in a very short period of time, but we can have a discussion later. So I want to leave some time for discussion at the end. It is at this point of time that you have the emergence of what we call new criticism. And this idea of new criticism as something is in itself interesting. So what does new criticism do? Now we know that what it does is it brings your attention back to the text. But at the same time, what new criticism is also doing is that it is moving you away from the author, because one of the principles of new criticism is that the author or understanding the intentions of the author is impossible. Okay. If you do that, then you get into something that they started calling intentional fallacy. So you have an intentional fallacy. If you impute intentions to the author, then you are reading something that you can't read. Okay. At the same time, what new criticism does is it removes the reader. Okay. Because the reader might have their own prejudices, their own emotions, their own feelings, their own affects that can affect the reading of the text. And therefore, if a reader indulges in that, you get into affective fallacy. Okay, so you have the intentional fallacy of the author, you have the affective fallacy of the reader. So you move the author and the reader away completely. You just leave the text. The problem is, how do you understand the text? So therefore, you have different kinds of devices to understand the text. And all of you, I'm sure, are aware of the different devices that new criticism promoted: paradox, irony, ambiguity, etc. And so what new criticism does at this point of time, it is called new criticism. Remember, it's not calling itself theory. It's saying that it is new. It is new because it is removing the author. Remember, a whole 100 years of author, the individual consciousness is there. It's removing the author, and it's also removing the reader. So the reader is not important anymore. Now, once this happens, a new criticism, remember, had a profound influence. In fact, many of our classrooms, even today, in many of the departments, in many of the English literature classrooms, are still seeped in new criticism. What we do in the class is basically new criticism. So we take a poem, we try to look at the text of the poem, we try to see what is happening in the poem, etc. And once that is done, we can go into sociological analysis, whatever, different forms of theoretical analysis that comes later. But the initial step is, of course, that of new criticism. And many of the answers in BA answer sheets that you get are basically new criticism, without any in-depth study of the theoretical models, etc. Now, if that is true, new criticism is an interesting intervention, which kind of removes the author, which removes the reader, and focuses your attention only on the text. That's it. There's nothing but the text. Okay? And the text can be understood within what they call the horizon of meaning. And so there is no plurality of meaning. The meaning is contained because the meaning is contained through devices in a text. And all you need to do is unspool those meanings. So the meanings are there. You need to just unravel them. And then once you unravel the meanings of the text becomes important to understand how the text functions. And it is at this point, I think, that one might need to think of the distinction between what we call criticism and what we call theory. So new criticism is at this important juncture, I think, where an old form of criticism, which had a sway for a very long time, is kind of merging into a new form of criticism that is slowly emerging. It's also interesting that new criticism came at the time when Saussure was actually delivering his lectures in Geneva, which came out in his book, A Course in General Linguistics. I'll not go into Saussure and structuralism and what structuralism does and how it develops into post-structuralism, etc., or postmodernism for that matter. But again, as I said, that we are going to stick to what do we understand in a broad sense, this distinction between criticism and theory. So what do we do in theory then? So how is theory therefore different, or what we call modern literary theory different from modern criticism? Now, of course, it comes from different disciplines, but so did criticism. I mean, if you look at early criticism by Rousseau, for example, so there were, or Hegel's famous essay on aesthetics, you will notice that, of course, he's not simply looking at literature or painting or architecture, etc. He brings in different sorts of disciplines into it. He talks about philosophy, he talks about history, he talks about anthropology, he talks about new forms of ethnology when he's talking about aesthetics. Okay, so interdisciplinarity is not something that is very recent. It was a part of the larger European tradition for a very long time. If you were a philosopher, you were supposed to be interdisciplinary. So what happens with theory at this point of time? And what is so distinctive about theory, which is different from the earlier forms of criticism that we have very little time to look into, but I hope that everyone's got the general idea that I'm trying to get to over here. So what happens with theory is that there are certain things in criticism that have been taken for granted. For example, this idea of the individual consciousness and the author, or the idea of this self-contained object called the text, which has self-contained meanings, which has meanings within its own, and the task of the critic is to unravel those meanings. Or the question of the reader, so who the reader is, and what does the reader do, what is the function of the reader, etc. So these are almost taken for granted in earlier schools of criticism. Okay. No one really questions what the author is, or who the reader is, or what the or for that matter, what the text is, because everyone assumes that the text is something that is in front of your eyes. Now, the questions that one raises, therefore, or one might raise, or one gets raised during this period of theory, are more fundamental in nature. And these questions pertain to, among many other things, and I'll stick only to these four because we don't have time to go through everything. So I'll just stick to what we can call the author, what we can call the reader, what we can call the text, and by text I mean writing, etc., and what we call the position, and I'll explain what I mean by the position at the end. So let's come to the author. Now, one of the questions that we need to understand, of course, is this idea of the author as someone who is the creative genius behind a text, is something, historically speaking, not very old. We know of large number of texts in ancient cultures, including Indian cultures, which do not have a textual author. So there might be a mythical author, might be a legendary author, but you don't really know what the author is. Okay? You just assign a name to something. And that is true of many other ancient cultures, like Homer. We don't really know who Homer is, but we all say it's Homer's Iliad or Homer's Odyssey, etc. Okay. So this idea of the modern author, this author who is the creative genius who has created a text, is something that is pretty recent. Now the question is, how does it come into existence, this idea of the author? Now if you go back to disciplines, then it's interesting. For example, literature for a very long time did not need an author. Okay? And you have this history of huge number of texts that did not have an author. You didn't know who the author was. So when we read, for example, Longinus' On the Sublime, we don't really know. People are still confused about who Longinus was. And so is the case with Shakespeare. I mean, I'm sure that you've heard all these debates about whether Shakespeare wrote this, whether Shakespeare wrote that, etc. Yeah. Whether they've sung about Shakespeare, I mean, there have been questions about that as well. But in science, at least till the 17th and the 18th century in Europe, it was absolutely important to have an author. So if you go discipline-wise, even authors, the position of the author or the greatness of the author depended on which discipline you belong to. So if you look at the entire history of science, then you needed an author till about the 16th, 17th, 18th century. In literature, that was not very important. Something happened around the 18th century which started making authors absolutely important. You needed a name for a text. Okay. And again, if you look at the disciplines, this kind of reversed itself. Okay. So literature needs an author now, but science doesn't. So there is a reversal. I'm sure that anyone would know who discovered the fountain pen. We don't know, but it was a part of science. Someone must have discovered it. We don't really know who did it. So scientific texts became much more open to public scrutiny. Okay. So it is what is contained in the text rather than who is the author. Of course, you still have to Nobel Prizes and everything, but we all know that people who get Nobel Prize in physics, it was announced just yesterday, uh, are not really the only ones who have worked on this. There must be hundreds of people who had worked and collaborated with them. So it's the idea that is more important and not really who has worked on it. In literature, it becomes absolutely important. You can't publish an anonymous book. It's very difficult to do that. Now, what happened, therefore, around the 18th, 19th century? Now, without going into details, one thing that happened was that there was a change in the legal system. So what we call copyright laws started coming into existence. And you can go back to the question, why were copyright laws required? And one of the reasons that they were required in Europe around the 18th century, what is known as the period of enlightenment, was that literature was seen more and more as subversive. Okay. So it would subvert the nature of power that is operating in governments, in states, in kingdoms, etc. So literature had this power of subverting things. And if you don't have an author whom you can jail and whom you can arrest, then there is a problem. So one of the reasons for copyright laws to come into existence was not only that authors would be recognized for their creative genius, that may be a part of it, but also because there was a legal juridical process through which now you can be tried. Okay. This almost coincides with the idea of the prisons. So what we call the modern prison or the modern prison system starts coming into existence around the 18th century. In fact, the first modern prison is built in France in 1782. Before that, remember, prisons were places where people were just thrown in. So if you're a thief or a robber or a liar or a person who has not paid his taxes or a person who has dreamt wrongly or a person who was loitering in the street, a madman, everyone was thrown into the prison. So that was the common place. But what we call the modern prison, which needed a judicial system, a legal system, which so you have trials, you have courts, you have judges, and then you are put into prison, comes into existence only during this period. So what you can see is the idea of the author is not simply who writes the text. The idea of the author is also connected to very different kinds of changes which seem to be unrelated to literature, but has an impact on it. For example, the legal system or the juridical system. For example, the copyright laws. For example, the nature of authorship. Who is the author? And of course, this desire for the author, so author became the center who can provide the meanings. And therefore, new criticism tries to do that. So you know that there is a central meaning to the text, and the task of the critic is to find that central meaning. So the author provides the authority to the text. And until you have an authority to the literary text, then it becomes problematic because the literary text becomes a jumble of meanings. So there is no meaning to the text. So if there is no meaning, then of course there's chaos, there's anarchy. So in order to contain that chaos, that anarchy, you need the figure of the authorial figure, okay, and in both the senses. So I'm using it as a pun. So it is the authorial figure. It is not simply the person who has created the text, but also the person who has authority over the meaning of the text. Now, once you start thinking in those lines, then you suddenly realize this idea of the author itself has been constructed over a period of time. Whatever I told you comes from Foucault. Okay? And this is what one of the things that theory does. Okay? So the question is no more the assumption that there is something called the author, okay, but the assumption that the figure of the author is also historically located, and not in simplistic terms like, the author is located in 18th century. You study the social history of 18th century or the political history of 18th century and say the author does this, okay? Because the figure of the author itself has never been seen in that sense, okay? Yes, please go ahead. Sorry. So there is a raising of the hand. Someone wanted to ask a question. Okay. All right. So I'll continue. But if you have the question, please do ask me. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end. We'll have a discussion. Let's come to the idea of the reader. Now, again, it has been assumed for a very long time that there is something called a passive reader who simply reads the text, understands the meaning of the text, etc. But then again, the question is this idea of the implied reader, and I'm sure that all of us who have done literary criticism would understand what the implied reader is something that has been assumed, again, for a very long time, that there is something called the implied reader. And the implied reader, again, is seen as stable, and therefore you can create this canonical text, right? So Shakespeare can therefore, the implied reader of Shakespeare in the 16th, 17th century, when he was a great playwright, still remains the implied reader of the 18th century when Shakespeare is canonized, remains the implied reader of the 19th century where there is a huge spread of Shakespeare across the colonies, and remains the implied reader in the 20th century or 21st century, etc. Without really thinking about where is the reader located, what's the context of the reader, how does the reader read a text? So for example, if I'm reading Shakespeare and I'm reading The Tempest, would I read The Tempest the same way as, for example, a white European man would be reading it in that sense? Would that be even possible? As a person who belongs to India, who knows the history of colonialism that is there, would I be reading The Tempest in a different way? And so the idea of the implied reader who would simply find the meanings in the text doesn't apply really, because the implied reader, depending on the context that you belong to, the history that you belong to, even the position that you have, and we'll come to the position at the end, but let me just introduce the term over here, even the position that you occupy. For example, if you're an English-educated college professor, then obviously, I mean, you are in a different position than a person who is uneducated, living in a rural area, and trying to read a translation of Shakespeare. So their approach to the text will be completely different, and they will bring their own understandings of the text. So if I'm reading The Tempest of Shakespeare today in post-colonial India, would I be simply saying, oh, that's great, great things happen to Caliban in The Tempest, and Ariel is a wonderful figure, and let me sympathize with Ariel and not with Caliban? Because if I go back to Caliban, then Caliban's condition is actually the condition of Indians under the British Empire. So here is probably a black man or a dark person whose island has been captured, whose mother has been killed, and he is forced to learn the language of the person who has captured that Prospero. And then he's supposed to follow the moral values and moral ethics of the conqueror. And then he, of course, cannot fall in love with a white woman. And that's what, remember, Caliban is accused of, that he's trying to rape Miranda. And if you then slightly probe this idea of the rape of the white woman, it's a very common idea around 1857 when the Sepoy Mutiny took place, where there was this huge thing about the white women getting raped by these brown men. And of course, you can see it in literature as well. So, for example, in Foster's Passage to India, the incident that happens in the Malabar caves, Dr. Aziz goes with this woman, I've forgotten her name now, into the caves, and she says that she has this strange experience and she believes that Dr. Aziz tried to rape her. Yeah. So this fear of the brown black man trying to rape the white woman or sexually assault the white woman is something that has been there right from Shakespeare. So it's a long tradition of European colonialism that has carried this through. Okay, and remember, that is the problem of Othello, this black mood, getting a white woman, and therefore all the complications, all the complexities, etc. How do you deal with it? And therefore, when I'm reading a text like Shakespeare as the reader, I am no more the implied reader. I'm someone else. And because I'm someone else, because I have a historical location, because I have a social location, because I have a gender location. So a man reading a text and a woman reading a text will be different experiences altogether. And because I have a community location. And in Indian conditions, maybe even a caste location. So all these locations will determine how I read a text. So the reader does play an important role in understanding what a text is, okay, and what they consider to be a text, etc. This is another fundamental question that is asked in theory. So it's no more an assumption that the reader simply exists as some ideal reader who will, interpret the text or decode the text in a certain way so that the meaning becomes clear. The third point, and I'll try to be quick so that we have some time for discussion. The third thing that I said is, what is a text? Okay, and I'll ask you the question that Foucault asks. Now, we all know there's been a lot of debate on Shakespeare's works. Okay, what has been written by him, how much of it has been written in collaboration with others. So there's a lot of texts. So, for example, a lot of people think that Cymbeline and his earlier texts, which was the revenge tragedy that he wrote, Coriolanus. So Coriolanus, for example, was probably, he collaborated with a large number of people to write that. Okay, so there's a lot of debates on that, which part of the text. And remember, most of Shakespearean texts were never found in forms of manuscripts. They were actually reconstructed through the actors. So Henning and Condell, who finally made the first folio of Shakespeare, actually went to actors who would remember the lines of Shakespeare's plays, and then they would jot them down and put them in the folio. So we don't really know whether the actors remembered correctly, whether they were improvising. We don't really know whether they were actually written by Shakespeare, etc. The second thing is, of course, we know that most of Shakespeare's texts were borrowings from others. So none of his texts are actually original in that sense. So they're adapted from stories, from histories, from mythologies, legends, etc. The third thing is, and that's the question that Foucault asked, imagine that you are someone who is located now, and someone finds in Shakespeare's house, let's assume, in Stratford-upon-Avon, in Shakespeare's house, in a hidden cupboard somewhere, someone finds a list of laundry that Shakespeare has put down, hoping that they will get washed. So he's putting the items of clothes on a list, and he has signed it William Shakespeare. Now the question is that we assume that whatever is a text is something that has literary qualities, etc., etc. The question over here that Foucault asks is, do we consider this as something of a text of Shakespeare, or do we not consider this as a text of Shakespeare? And I'll very quickly give the arguments that he's giving. If we don't consider this as a text of Shakespeare, then we assume already there is a presupposition that to be a text, you need to fulfill these conditions. There is a presupposition that to be a literary text, these conditions have to be fulfilled. Okay? But remember, these are very vague conditions. What is a literary text actually? What makes literature literature? Because we know that historically speaking, a large number of women's texts that were written in the 16th and the 17th, 18th century were simply excluded from histories of literature because they were not considered to be literature. So you have different forms of taste, different forms of judging what is literary at different historical periods. Okay, a large number of, for example, Dalit texts were excluded from histories of many regional languages, or Adivasi texts, tribal texts, which were completely excluded. For a very long time in South Africa, Black writers were never included in any anthology. Yeah? So what is literature is always problematic. When we say that literary text should possess these things, and only then will we admit them as literature, then it becomes problematic, because then we are excluding. In order to include certain texts, we also have rules of exclusion. So we'll exclude certain things from that list. Okay. And historically speaking, this has been done with women, this has been done with Blacks, this has been done with different communities, this has been done with even, for example, the LGBTQ communities. Foster, for example, young Foster, who was gay, never could reveal his identity, and never came out of the closet in that sense, etc. Because you would not be considered as a literary figure if you were considered to be a homosexual man. So what is then a text? And this is another fundamental question that theory asks. So what is a text, and what do we, and therefore the question is not to find a definition of what a text is, but try to understand that what we call a text or a literary text has its own problematics. We need to understand that there are ways in which literary text has manipulated some texts to be understood as texts and some texts to be understood as non-texts. Okay? They have been absented, they have been erased from histories. And therefore, we need to kind of bring in. That is what, for example, feminism does. At least in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, a large number of feminist authors tried to bring back texts that had been completely relegated to the history and the margins of history. No one really knew that these women wrote. I mean, how many people actually know that there were a large number of romantic women writers? During the age of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats, all these male writers, even when we study Romanticism today, we study them. But there were many, many women writers who were writing poetry, what was called romantic poetry, etc. So this is the third concern. And I'll stop with the concern of position because I promised that, though we are running out of time now. Now, when I say position, one of the things that theory also looks into is it depends on the kind of framework that you use to understand anything in literature. Okay? So this framework can be gender, it can be class, it can be caste, it can be community, it can be race, anything. More recently, of course, there is a lot of studies and a lot of focus on what is known as intersectionality. So, because you really can't separate gender and class and caste and race because they kind of intersect together. There is a kind of intersectional attitude between them. So it does not only depend upon what gender you belong to, but also probably, for example, which class do you belong to? Because women or men belonging to different classes also will have different perceptions, different histories, different trajectories. Yeah? Similarly, the race that you belong to, so if you're a woman of a lower income group of a Black woman, then you would have a completely different trajectory to understand what a text is, what literature is, what author is, what reader is, than a white woman of a low income group, etc., etc. So there is a lot of intersectionality within that. So that positioning probably is important. And that is another concern that literary theory has. So what I have very quickly to sum up what I was trying to do throughout this is to understand this entire distinction, not only between criticism and theory, but also the historical trajectory from which we move from criticism to what we call literary theory today. Of course, I didn't touch post-colonialism or other things, but if you have questions and discussions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Green.
Sir, my question is, first of all, thank you for the wonderful session. And my question is, sir, how do psychoanalytic theories like those of Freud, Sigmund Freud, influence character analysis in modern literature?
Okay. Very quickly again, because psychoanalysis, of course, is a massive subject. It will take probably a whole semester to teach it. But let me tell you that one thing that I didn't mention, because it would have taken us into a digression, is that movement that I told you from individual consciousness of romantic criticism to new criticism. So this 100 years, 1798 to let's say 1920s, you have to take into consideration two major interventions that happens in the history of European thought. And that is Marx, who starts, well, he publishes his Communist Manifesto in 1848, but then, of course, his Capital comes out in 1870s. And what Marx does is that he suddenly shows you that literature is not simply innocent. It's not simply meaning-making, okay? Because it is a form of ideology. The second is, of course, Freud. Okay? And therefore, Freudian psychoanalysis completely creates an imbalance, actually. So if you look at Freudian psychoanalysis, this idea of the stable individual consciousness, the stable author, completely disappears with Freud. Because Freud says it's unstable, it's completely unstable. In fact, most of the time, you're not even in control of yourself. Forget about what you write. In fact, if you look at his famous essay on daydreaming and jokes,
Yes.
So what he says is that what you write is a conscious attempt to cover up all those libidinal desires that are playing around in unconscious. Okay, so your writing is a constant effort to kind of cover it up. Okay? And therefore, these two cannot be completely, never to be discarded. I should rephrase this, because they play a very, very important role in producing what we call literary theory today. Okay? So you cannot have literary theory without the intervention of Marx and Freud, and of course, Saussure and structuralism. So these three are central figures to this idea. Now, how do you use that into literary pieces? I would suggest that one of the best examples of doing it, though he does it with the help of Jung and not Freud directly, is Northrop Frye. So he has this entire book of literary criticism, which is based on psychoanalysis. I would suggest that you have a look at that book. It was published in 1954. And then see. Okay?
Sure, sir. Sure. Thank you so much, sir.
I think Bernita has raised a hand.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you for such a wonderful session. I must say you are really a very good orator, sir. Without having any PowerPoint presentation also, it was very nice to listen to you, sir. Sir, my question is, sir, you are talking about individual consciousness. So just I want to know, sir, when in class we teach Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, in any way can we match individual consciousness and concept of Roland Barthes?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. That's a very good question. So what Barthes is challenging, remember, he's not, so it's a tongue-in-cheek, that essay, you know, so it's, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. It is basically a provocative essay. It provokes you. What he means is, of course, the author is living. Okay, what he is not talking about the physical author in the essay. What he's talking about is this idea of the authorial control over the text. So what I said, the idea of the authority. So the author was constructed historically to create an authority on the text, because you could fall back upon the author. If there is an author, then you can say, there is a central meaning to the text. Now, Barthes is questioning that. So in a sense, you're right. In a sense, he's also questioning this idea of this individual consciousness. But as I was responding to the question of psychoanalysis by Dr. Yogita, the idea of the individual consciousness is already unstable, destabilized through Freud. Okay. So Locke is kind of picking up on that. So you have this double disjunction. So if you remember, he says there is this readerly text and writerly text. So the readerly text is the text which tries to stabilize the meaning, while the writerly text is the text which explodes meaning. So there is a jouissance, that's what he says. So there's an explosion of meaning. And that is where the author dies. So the author does not have any control over the text. So that's his argument over there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I understand. Thank you, sir.
If there is any other comment or question. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Is someone going to close the session, or I think we should all disband?
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your informative session. On behalf of A.C.T Academy, its board and director, I would like to record my sincere thanks to the resource person of today's session. And thank you, participants. Let's meet in tomorrow's session. Thank you, one and all. Kindly
Thank you.
fill the feedback form without fail. Thank you, sir.